This week, the hot topic on Bottom Line is taxes, and we have a panel of noted experts to talk about the implication of state and federal tax reform that's currently being debated both in Raleigh and in Washington, D.C. Joining us are Roland Krosklos, a CPA and partner with the firm of Johnson Price Sprinkle in Asheville, Bill Nelson, a partner with the law firm of Smith Anderson and an expert on tax law, and Dr. Mike Walden, the William Neal Reynolds Professor at NC State and a noted economist. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dr. Walden, let's start with you. Talk a little bit about the implication of tax and tax policy on the overall economy of North Carolina, the country, and the world.
Well, it's a factor. I mean, when businesses look to locate, when individuals look to locate, taxes are a factor. I wouldn't say they're the most important factor, but they are a factor. And North Carolina has made a lot of changes in their tax structure in recent years. Broadly speaking, they've tried to expand the tax base, but lower rates. Economists have long advocated that. I think the most noteworthy thing from an economic development point of view is the change in the corporate income tax rate. We had, I think, at one point the highest corporate income tax rate of states that have them. Now, I believe, of the states that have a corporate income tax rate, we have the lowest. That's an amazing change. And economic analysis shows that's probably the key tax factor that is most important in affecting economic growth.
Well, when I talk to business leaders around the state, they talk about the complexity of tax code as being a particular challenge. Roland, as a practitioner, what do you hear from your clients about the difficulties they face trying to figure out the tax codes?
It certainly makes the phones ring in asking us if there's new legislation, or even what if I do this, what does that mean, what does that look like? And so there's tremendous complexity there. Some of them have gotten used to just, I got to call, I got to find out what this means. Others get frustrated by it. And it definitely makes it difficult for them to navigate. There's not one answer. There's not one answer that has the ticket for the best tax results. There's typically a variety or a mixture of answers that solve the problem.
Well, Bill, as somebody that knows the tax code, what would you say? What would be some good changes to the system of taxation that might make it more straightforward or easier for businesses to understand?
Well, as Mike said, here in North Carolina, we've made a lot of very helpful changes already. We've gotten the rates down, we've broadened the base. The recent budget bill that just came out of conference earlier this week continues that policy by driving rates down further. The corporate income tax rate would go down to 2.5% in 2019. The personal income tax rate would go down to 5.25% in 2019. The budget bill also includes a significant provision in the repeal of the so-called mill machinery tax. This is essentially a sales tax on business-to-business transactions, which most economists would say is a bad idea because it results in sort of a pyramiding of the tax burden as products move through the chain of production and distribution and finally retail sale. So getting rid of the mill machinery tax was a very big step.
One thing I would say in terms of broadening the base, which has primarily been done on the sales tax side, and the issue there, of course, is when the sales tax was instituted in the 30s, there wasn't a service sector. It was a goods sector, so it was primarily tax on goods. They've broadened it to some services. I think the key word there is some services, and I think that's caused some complications, some uncertainty, some head scratching about why is this service taxed and why is this service not taxed. I would encourage General Assembly perhaps to look at that in future sessions.
Well, as the issue of tax reform, tax modernization winds its way through Congress, what are some of the things you would suggest that the federal tax code be changed to make it simple, more straightforward, other things? Some discussion as to whether it'll just be a reduction of rates or an actual wholesale reform, but what do you think? Wave a magic wand. What do you think those changes need to be?
I'm going to pick on one that I think everybody could agree with, and that's AMT, Alternative Minimum Tax. It's what I'll call a shadow tax system. If we don't get you here, we'll get you here. Started, many years ago with 5 or 6 or a handful of people that weren't maybe paying their fair share. And now there are thousands of Americans paying it. And it complicates the tax system significantly. And every legislator we've talked to has no concern about eliminating that. It obviously is embedded in and tied into a lot of other parts of the tax code, but if we could eliminate AMT, I think that'd be a great solution.
Other changes?
Well, one of the big questions is what do you do about deductions, credits, exemptions, which the federal tax code is loaded with. And economists would argue that obviously increases complications. It makes some people benefit from something, others not. I would try to eliminate as many of those as I could. That's tough going because behind every deduction is a group. But I think if we could decrease the number of exemptions, credits, and deductions, broaden the tax base, lower tax rates, I think that's a formula for faster economic growth.
I would agree that to me the most important thing is to get the rates down. The United States is terribly uncompetitive. We have the highest corporate income tax rate in the OECD, and according to one study, the second highest corporate income tax rate in the entire world, surpassed only by the United Arab Emirates. We were number 3, but Chad recently reduced its corporate income tax rate, so now we're up to number 2. Another thing that I think Congress should consider, and I believe they are, is moving from the so-called worldwide system of taxation, where a U.S. corporation pays tax on its income earned anywhere in the world, to a territorial system. Most of our trading partners have territorial systems, which would mean that a U.S. corporation or any corporation would pay only tax in the United States on the income earned here.
And a lot of people think that that would bring perhaps a couple trillion of dollars back to the U.S. because it's sitting in foreign countries because of the fear of being taxed here. One other thing I would say in terms of an activist move by the government would be, I like the earned income tax credit a lot. I think that's a very efficient way of helping low-income people. I'd like to see that expanded, make deeper at the federal level.
Now, when you talk to your clients about taxation, what are some of the things they specifically mention as being challenges administratively? What are the difficult parts of it for a company to figure out how to make sure that the preparation of their tax is not overwhelming them?
I think, particularly with businesses, work a lot with closely held businesses, family-owned businesses, understanding what to even bring up, what matters, what's going to make a difference. And consistently, they'll bring up things that don't really make a difference, but we have to probe a little bit and find out what's really going on. Oh, really? That would make a change? I could have done something differently. And so we have to engage in conversation throughout the year, because what they expect might make a difference doesn't always. For example, spending money doesn't always correlate to an expense. You might be paying off some debt, and you don't get deduction for paying off debt. You get deduction for maybe for the item that you buy. So just helping them understand, they're concentrated on cash flow. And so they're very interested in what money goes out the door, but when they find out that that taxes don't necessarily follow cash flow, it's a real struggle for them.
You know, in some of the conversations I have with business leaders around the state, they talk about the increasing globalization of the economy. Even a small business in North Carolina may have enterprise operations in other parts of the world. What about we talked a little bit about this, but what about this increasing sense of our economy as being tied to a bigger global economy? How does our tax policy need to reflect making sure we're competitive in this environment where we're doing business in Southeast Asia as well as in South Carolina?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and we've had several clients over the years, startup companies, commercializing technology. They like it here because there's an educated workforce, there's access to capital, but when they get to the commercialization stage and they start earning money and they realize how draconian and punitive the U.S. tax system is, they scratch their heads and say, you know, we could have organized in the Netherlands or in Switzerland and had a much more favorable tax regime. And at this point, though, their technology is too valuable to move offshore. There's basically an exit tax on moving the intellectual property offshore. But I've seen time and again founders of companies just kick themselves for starting their businesses here. And it's a terrible thing that they should feel that they're better off starting their business somewhere in Europe or elsewhere.
My perception is most businesses don't mind paying taxes. I think what they get upset about, at least what they tell me they get upset about, is they think they're not being treated fairly, someone else is getting a benefit, someone else has found a loophole. So I think if we can move both at the state level and the federal level towards simplification, making the tax system easily understood, make it treat pretty much everyone the same way, don't have special little deductions and loopholes for people who do certain things, I think that would go a long way toward acceptance of paying taxes, compliance, et cetera.
Is it possible that this increasingly complex economy of ours, not just the fact that it's increasingly global, but the types of industries that we have in North Carolina, very different than our history of textiles and manufacturing and agribusiness, are we at risk of making ourselves less than competitive as a global player?
I think it's certainly helpful to broaden the base and to lower those rates. That allows a lot more flexibility, as the comments were made earlier. No matter what the business is, something we haven't even thought of yet that someone comes up with, it's a new business model, it allows them to pay their fair share, but also not be killed by the fact that the law didn't anticipate their particular type of business, whether that's locally or internationally.
And that's going to be an issue, I think, more so in the future because the economy is so dynamic now, it's changing. how we make things. We may, for example, take manufacturing out of the factory into the household with 3D and 4D manufacturing in the future. What's that going to do to the taxes? So I think we have to look ahead and say, we really don't know how the economy is going to change. So if we can simplify the tax code that it applies to any sort of economic regime, that'll be a plus.
There's an old saying that the only thing harder than getting a special tax break into the code is getting it out, because all sorts of vested interest accrete around it. And I think that goes to your point that legislators aren't always the best in picking winners and losers. Let's keep it simple, keep the rates low, keep the base broad.
Great conversation, panel. Thank you so much.